I'm excited to bring this Sunday's message. This is one of the great stories, one of the forming stories in all of Scripture. Good morning, everyone, by the way. I'm just finally looking at you. Sorry about that. Stories are really important. They help us understand who we are. Like our identities will always be wrapped up in the stories that we find ourselves in. So today we're going to tell a part of the story that becomes the generating force. I don't know, I struggled for words to describe this, but the story that we're going to look at today will become the generating force for understanding who we are, whether you were Jewish or Christian. Like Jewish observant Jews will begin the words of the Passover evening by saying, "We were slaves in Egypt." And they mean it. We. For us, our weekly observance of communion, the bread and the cup, it's rooted in that Passover meal that we're going to learn about today. And our story as Christians, it can't be told without the words, "It was on the night that he was betrayed." And baptism, we love being able to immerse people in the sanctuary. Baptism is going down under the waters and coming up out, going through the waters to our death and coming up alive. It finds its prototype, if I can use that word, in the Israelites walking through the waters of the sea. And when they emerge on the other side, they're no longer going to be slaves of this world's empire, but they're going to be people belonging to the one true God. Communion and baptism, these are our sacraments. And they go all the way back to how God was working in the rescue of the Exodus. And there's a pattern that you're going to hear, a pattern that takes shape. It's the from, through, to pattern. I have that in your message notes, and I just want you to be having that pattern in mind as we share the story. It's the pattern where God takes us from one particular state or one particular condition that we're in, and by his hands he leads us through a season or circumstances that test us until we come to a better place. So watch for the from, through, to in today's story that we call the rescue. Now, the story of the rescue, it doesn't actually begin with people needing to be rescued. It begins with a people who were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons and their families. There were 70 in all, and in the land that they were living, there was a famine, and so they journeyed down to Egypt, where one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, has risen to prominent leadership, and through his craftiness in leading has been able to provide food for many thousands of people who were starving because of the famine. And so Jacob's family travels down into Egypt, and for generations, they will thrive in Egypt. They don't need rescued. They're doing quite well in this land. The original creation mandate that we heard in Genesis 1, to be fruitful and multiply, that's exactly where the story starts in Exodus 1. It says they were fruitful and multiplied. How about that? In Exodus 1, they're fulfilling the Genesis 1 creation mandate. Until there comes along this king of Egypt. The Pharaoh is his title. And the story says that Pharaoh says, "We must deal shrewdly with this people." And he says this out of fear. These people he says, are becoming too numerous. There's too many of them. And he says, we are going to lose our country to them. That's what he says. He's afraid of these non-Egyptians, these Hebrews, who they've known no other home. They were born in Egypt. They grew up in Egypt. They made a life in Egypt. They prospered in Egypt, and they helped Egypt to prosper. And this king is suddenly afraid of them. And so they must be dealt with harshly. Now, you're going to need to remember this, because later in the story, God will bring the Hebrews into the land that he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he will tell them, remember who you were in Egypt. Remember how they treated you in Egypt. You must not do that. He actually tells them numerous times. He said, you must treat the immigrant as one of your own. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he says, if you deal harshly with the immigrant in the land that I gave you, well, this is what he actually says. When an immigrant, an alien, resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the immigrant. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. No difference. The laws were to be no different. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Whenever he says a law and says, I'm the Lord your God, it's like, I really mean it. And whoever acts high-handedly, whether native or immigrant, will be an affront to the Lord. Failure to honor God and treating the immigrant properly will result for them in the same outcome as breaking God's covenant in any of its specifics. God says, again, more than once, you will be vomited out of the land. So don't do that, God says to the Israelites, because you must remember how you were treated yourself. So Pharaoh has a plan, and his plan A is to have the Hebrew midwives kill baby boys as soon as they were born. So the Hebrew midwives would position themselves in the catching position, and if it's a boy that comes out, immediately kill him. They refused. Plan B was to exterminate the baby boys by throwing them into the Nile River. Now, when Pharaoh refuses to let the Hebrews go, the first of the 10 plagues is Moses turning the Nile River into blood. This is like Exhibit 7 or 77, that the wrath of God is nothing other than God letting us experience the full brunt of our rebellious choices. By the time Moses had turned the river to blood, Pharaoh had already filled the Nile with the blood of Hebrew baby boys. And the 10th and final plague will be Pharaoh's curse, being carried out on his own people. And the firstborn males of every household will be taken in death. The wrath of God has always been and will always be the absence of his mercy that somehow would lessen the brutal effects of our sins upon ourselves. But we're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit. There was a particular Hebrew baby boy who was saved from being thrown into the river when his mother told his sister to put your brother in a basket and float him along the riverbanks of the Nile. So the boy would float in It's like an ark. It's like ark-like basket above the waters that had already destroyed so many other lives. And ironically, it was Pharaoh's daughter who found him and adopted him and gave him the name Moses. And then Pharaoh's daughter unwittingly recruited Moses' own mother to nurse him. Moses will be raised in Pharaoh's court until he kills an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew slave, and he flees for his life in the countryside of Midian, and there for 40 years he shepherds the flock of the man who will become his father-in-law, until one day there's a tree bush on a mountainside blazing with the presence of God, and God tells Moses to be the rescuer of his people. It says God said he had heard their cries. Just as God heard the cries of the blood of Abel crying from the ground that had been shed upon, God hears the cries of the slave. That's what it says. He hears the cries of the slave. He hears the cry of the mother whose baby boy is ripped from her arms. He hears the cries of all through the Old Testament of the injustices that are done to people that are oppressed, of people that are being treated as other than images of God in all forms. He hears those cries, whether we hear them or not. And in response to those cries, he calls Moses. Moses would rather have nothing to do with it. Moses begins as the most reluctant deliverer. After extensive negotiating with God, Moses sighs, says, oh, just send somebody else. And God compromises with him and says, your brother Aaron can go with you. Moses knows his ways around Pharaoh's court. He takes his brother with him, and they go to the Pharaoh and they ask the most powerful person in the world's most powerful empire to let my people go. In the name of Yahweh, their God, let his people go. And Pharaoh says, I do not know this God, and I will not let his people go. Now, the merciful nature of God was to give Pharaoh chance after chance, 9 times over. 9 plagues to gradually demonstrate that Pharaoh will not want to take on the God of the slaves. And Pharaoh loses every time until the 10th plague comes. Remember we said that the wrath of God is the removal of his hand of mercy that allows us to experience the full brunt, the full force of our rebellious choices. Pharaoh had killed all the boys born to Hebrew women. Now, the angel of death, whom Pharaoh had invited into his land already, the angel of death would go through and take the lives of all the firstborn males. And even then, God's mercy would still be available. God says, take a lamb, a whole lamb, a lamb without blemish, and sacrifice it. Eat the meat, but take the blood and spread it across the header of your doors and down the doorposts. And when the angel of death sees the blood of the lamb, it will pass over that home, and all who take refuge in the home under the door where the blood has been shed will be saved. Now, This salvation was not just available for the Hebrews. This same salvation was available for the Egyptians as well. Any Egyptian could be saved from death in the same way, declaring covenant faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and demonstrating that faith through the mark of circumcision and participating in the meal of the sacrificial lamb. Any who were under the blood would be saved. And many Egyptians were. This final meal, this Last Supper in Egypt, would be commemorated from that time forth. The Passover meal continues to be practiced by observant Jews today around the world. This year, the Seder meal will be eaten April 12th and 13th, and the feast of the Passover will last until April 20th, because God doesn't have days. He has weeks. The feast is one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts, meaning that ideally it would be observed in Jerusalem. And so after the meal, they will say, next year in Jerusalem. Observant Jews cherish Passover as the first half of the saving act of God. It is the defining saving act of God in delivering them from oppression in Egypt. Second half of the saving act of God, well, that comes pretty quickly. That night of the Passover, that was a night of terror. Undoubtedly, crying and mourning and the wails of mothers cradling their firstborn could be heard throughout the land. And when the night had finally passed, Pharaoh relented one more time and told Moses to take his people and leave. Please just leave. And so they left. And they didn't leave empty-handed. But many of the riches and the gifts from the Egyptians, people that were glad that they were going, went with them. But tragically, one more time, this king of Egypt thought he could outduel the world's one true king, and so he chased God's people down. And God had brought his people to a precarious place, a place where they would have to trust him or perish. That's where they were. Trust me or perish. In this precarious place, they looked behind them, and behind them there was the army of Pharaoh's horses and Pharaoh's chariots and Pharaoh's killing machines. And they were being led by the Pharaoh himself, a raging, mad, bloodthirsty king who would bear down on him. And then in front of them was the sea. Be slaughtered or be drowned. That's the precarious place that they were in. And they said to Moses, "Why did you bring us here to die? We could have died in Egypt. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? What have you done to us by rescuing us and saving us? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone to be slaves in Egypt. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that Yahweh will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only keep still." Well, you saw the movie. You know what happens next. Moses takes his staff and he touches the waters, and the sea parts. You've heard this before. The text says, God sent a wind. We can't be surprised by this time. God sent a wind, the breath, the Spirit of God separates the waters. We saw that in creation. And the chaos waters divide as the Spirit of God broods over the chaos. The decreation waters of the flood disperse when God sends his wind over them. Now for a third time, the life-giving Spirit of God blows over waters that would have buried them in death. And instead, the Israelites will pass through on dry land. Now, very foolishly, the Egyptian army pursues them, going through the same sea. But once the Israelites are safely on the other side, the wind that kept the waters back subsides. Had not Pharaoh rejected the Spirit of God continuously? And so once more, God draws his Spirit back. He draws his wind back, and the waters collapse on them, and they all perish. Now, you will not read of this in the historical annals of Egypt, because the empires of this world seldom record their failures or their humiliating defeats. But there is a record of it. There's the written record. There's a living record. Every Jewish person is a record, including the one that we love and serve, the Messiah Jesus himself, the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This Passover night and this crossing of the sea, these two mighty acts of God, this is the saving, the deliverance, the rescue of the Israelites. This is the Exodus from slavery through the sea to where? To the mountain of God. From slavery through the sea to the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, where God would reveal himself for the first time to all of Israel, where he would enter into a covenant with them. He spoke to them and said, I'm the Lord, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he gave them the 10 words, the 10 commandments, by which they would know his character. And then he gave them the tabernacle, by which they would know his presence. And for 40 years, they would sojourn through the wilderness. They would have numerous failings. They would have times of faithlessness. But God was always faithful, providing for them daily bread, providing for them forgiveness from their sin, leading them through the time of testing, from the mountain through the wilderness to the edge of the Jordan River, where Joshua, their new leader, will take them across again on dry land, and they would settle in to that land promised to Abraham, where God would reign as their one true king. Well, that is, for a time, until they rejected him and wanted their own king. Pastor Tyler is going to tell us about that next week. For now, would you think this through? Think about the words that Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. Lead us through the time of testing. bring us to the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Think about that most beloved Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. God takes us from the still waters and the green pastures, and he leads us through the valley of the shadow of death and brings us to the table that he's prepared for us, the banquet table where my cup overflows. There's always a from, through, and a to. But we often get stuck in the through, don't we? When we get stuck in the through, we look back to the to. We look back to where we were. And just like the Hebrew slaves, like, that was better than this. Let's go back to that. And you know what? They said that more than once. Like in their faithless times in the wilderness, they said that. Let's go back to Egypt. But they learn eventually to trust God in the wilderness, the time of testing, the time of going through. And then he brings them to that promised land. But that cycle will happen again, and it'll happen again, and it'll happen again. And you might be caught in that cycle right now. So today I want to remind you that as followers of Jesus, he has already gone through the ultimate from, through, and to. From heaven, where with God the Father and God the Spirit, he enjoyed the eternal loving that was amongst them. And he went from that to where we are, and he went through life on our earth. He went through the death of the cross. He went through the grave, and he came to resurrection and ascension and to new creation. Jesus has passed through the ultimate from, through, and to. And if you attach yourself to Jesus, say yes to Jesus. Like, you are my Lord and my King. I attach myself to you and to you alone. Will you take me from this place I'm at now? Will you lead me through my time of testing? And will you bring me to the place of life, and new life? So that can be yours today.